So that was tremendous. Karen and Florence and Don and Jeet, really provocative and thoughtful and powerful presentations. Thank you for them. We had thought we might start with some back and forth amongst the panel, but I'm wondering now if we might just turn straight to the audience and perhaps end with some back and forth amongst the panel if it unfolds that way. So let's do that. We are welcome to come to the microphone and speak there. We do have the video recording happening, and as Jane mentioned at the beginning, if you'd prefer your comments not to be recorded, just wave at Natalie and we'll know that. We can delete them from the record afterwards if you wish for that to happen. And she is, again, only recording the faces of the panel members, if that's important to you. So please join us. Come forward. Questions, comments?
Recalling when we talk about these things about saying, well, perhaps there's not enough opportunities for courses within the university right now, that at my time, when Lyndon Johnson was actually speaking of those things, I was a student here at McMaster University in the English department. And our big issue as young students at that particular time in the undergraduate was that our university wasn't Canadian enough. It was too European and too American. Of course, all of this was just after the great revival of 1967 and so on. But at that time, in our department, there weren't any Canadian literature courses. As Canadians, we were considered at that time, and this is the 60s, colonials. Our English department offered a little bit of Canadian literature under the aspect of colonial literature, in which we lumped it together with South African, New Zealand, Australian, and it was only a half a term. It was only a half a term. So evolutionary as student activists, we finally got a Canadian literature, purely Canadian literature course in 1971. So we're talking 40 years ago, we finally got our first Canadian literature course. So evolutionary, I'm hoping that the English department still does have a Canadian literature course, and that it's not reduced to all hyphenated stuff. Now, my question is that in the time, and we're talking about the economic pressures, of course, of what's saying too Asian. It's the competitive idea of saying, as with the Great Peril, it was saying it's an economic issue as much as anything else. All those engineers are going to study all the engineering designs and take them back and do stealth bombers and so on from Waterloo. When the first great economic pressure came up in recent history, which was the Japanese, and the great Japanese competition, economic competition with North America came along, the great rush, at least in America, if not in Canada, was to institute a great mass of, let's study Japanese in our schools, our high schools. Let's put Japanese courses into our universities. Now we seem to be in the same place. Well, Japan has had a bit of an economic downturn since that time. But now we're dealing with the same thing. Why are we not rushing to put, in the same way that we responded to the Japanese economic powerhouse at that time, the same strategy into our high schools and into our universities quickly, as we did in those days of the Japanese invasion?
Can I take that? Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point because sorry. That's a very interesting point, although I think the example that you use could argue for the reverse, that I do actually think that a lot of the anxiety that's informing the Two Asian article, but also some of the other public debates, the Tiger Mother article that the Wall Street Journal did, and saying Chinese mothers are better because they can discipline their kids and make them into hard workers. A lot of that is coming out of a kind of geopolitical concern, that there is this kind of larger fear of that China is on the rise and that the United States is going down. But I think if you look at these things historically, these fears always have an element of a moral panic or a panic and are always fraudulent. I mean, William Randolph Hearst was worried about the rise of Asia in the late 19th century. And all those concerns about how we have to learn Japanese in the 1980s were quickly dissipated during the 1990s when Japan went through the long period of economic doldrums. So I think that it's, undergirding all this is a kind of Darwinian view of human existence, that we're all in these little groups and that we're competing for the little piece that we have, and that if China is getting better, we must be getting worse. And it's interesting that the people who make this sort of argument are coming from a free market point of view, because classically, the classical liberalism of, say, Adam Smith argues that no, it's not the case that if another country, a poor country is getting better, that the wealthy country is getting worse. That actually, if we're all getting better, that's good for everyone. So it's interesting that even despite the fact that we live in an age of neoliberalism, that there's still behind this kind of mercantilist fear, and I would argue a neo-Darwinian fear of the sort of global competition, and that we have to get our kids working hard, or the tiger mothers of and the dragon ladies of Asia will seize control.
So we can take questions from other audience members. Welcome. Go ahead. Come on up.
Hi. I think I have a question, kind of a provocative question for Karen and Florence. Earlier, Karen, you were talking about the discourse of the perpetual foreigner that was being used by the Maclean's article, and it just kind of got me thinking, oh, and you were also talking about, like, that, more Chinese Canadians need to recognize this 150-year-long settlement in Canada. And it just kind of got me thinking about this panel, about how it's called Beyond to Asian, Going Beyond to Asian, and I'm just gonna ask a provocative question. I mean, aren't we all perpetual foreigners in a way, in the sense that, we're all settlers who enjoy and benefit from treaty rights? And I guess my question that would be more for Florence would be, if we're going to, if we're going to start these initiatives, like these anti-racist youth initiatives, I mean, wouldn't these, I don't see how any anti-racist youth initiative wouldn't also consider strategies that are anti-colonial and, anti-sexist and what are the other ones, anti-classist, I don't know, those are just some preliminary thoughts that I was thinking of when you two were talking.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think especially in this kind of activism that it can't just be an anti-one thing at a time. Otherwise, as was mentioned by other panelists, they're going to take a divide and conquer tactic against us, that if we are fighting anti-oppression, that we have to fight all oppressions and see that we have allies that are fighting similar fights. I think at the same time, there are opportunities to find common ground with people who are in similar situations, but there is also a need for us when an opportunity arises for us to build up our own communities and build our own strength. And in this way, it sort of has woken us up a little bit. I think, W5 was 30 years ago, and people were like, well, that happened a long time ago, and maybe we're just, doing our own thing. And I was talking to an activist from the Japanese community who was very involved in the Japanese redress for the internments, and he said that his community has been asleep, is how he put it. And he felt, in some respects, as much as he was upset by the Maclean's article, that it was a gift, that we were taking things for granted, and this woke up the community. And it was because this particular article was targeted at the Asian community that our communities woke up. So I totally agree with you that when we're doing this work, we have to be aware of Islamophobia, and we have to be aware of anti-Semitism and anti-feminists and anti-Native Americans and all of this sort of thing. But we still need to be responsible for our piece of it. And because I am Chinese Canadian, as much as I chose not to identify that way for as long as I could, I feel a larger responsibility to working on anti-Asian racism, right? The organization that I work for, the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter, we work with a lot of coalitions in Toronto. There's a group called the Alternative Planning Group, where I work with my counterparts in the Hispanic communities, as well as the South Asian and continental African communities. And the four organizations get together on a regular basis to talk about what is our common ground and what are the common issues that we're dealing with respect to access to services, with respect to immigration issues, because there are a lot of things that we can work on together. And we, are members of a number of different coalitions, the Color of Poverty campaign, Good Jobs for All campaign. And so there are a lot of opportunities to work with different groups. But I certainly hear you when you question, like, should we be so focused on one thing? I know you had a bigger question than that, and I was going to write it down and I didn't. But hopefully that touches on some of what you were thinking about.
I guess I just have a little bit to add in relation to the Youth Coalition. We actually had this very same issue. For a lot of us, it was kind of a starting point, this article. So for a lot of people that didn't ever think about issues like racism, they came out to this event, and this was probably their first time speaking about it and learning that language. So we hope that this could be kind of this thing that could bring us together. And the Youth Coalition had this issue of how to make sure this coalition is inclusive. So how the people around that table, the steering committee, was representative or as representative as it could be. So you did bring up a really good point, and we're constantly trying to make sure that it's not always Chinese-centric or Asian-centric, that we're trying to include as many people as possible, but it really is kind of an ongoing struggle and a challenge that we hope to fight, I guess.
I just wanted to add a point that we have been struggling with, is that this Maclean's article is anti-Asian, and a lot of the community activists who have been working on this issue have been from the Chinese community. And there have been many discussions that we've had both with the Youth Coalition and with some other individuals who have been working on the Open Letter Coalition, that we don't really think it's to our benefit for this to be a Chinese campaign, that we do need other Asian faces, that this is more than just about the Chinese community, and it is actually about more than just the Asian community. But I think it's also an issue of capacity and expertise and history. My organization is part of, we're one chapter of a national organization that has 30 years of experience doing media advocacy. So when this Maclean's issue came out, the national office organized a press conference within 2 hours of this hitting the internet. And there are many other organizations and community groups who are interested in doing work around this issue, but they don't have the same experience organizing those press conferences or organizing these kinds of meetings. Even now, as we're talking to different campuses across the country who are interested in organizing forums like this, some of them haven't organized these types of events before, and so they're coming to us for advice. So I think there is a bit of a learning curve for everyone, and I think it's a good thing that we can learn from each other.
I'm going to try and say two things. First is a response or attempt to kind of engage with what the first speaker said, and the second it will be an attempt to kind of ask, engage with the question that both of you engaged with. The first one is Canadian literature still being taught in the English department? Yes. Some of us are still doing Canadian literature, me included. But more so, you said something which I think it might seem like it's different from, it's apart from what's happening here, but it's actually, you said two things, which for me was very, it was coded, racially coded. One being, are they still teaching purely Canadian literature? And move away from this hyphenated stuff. And I think that purely Canadian literature, what's being said is that white people are still being read. Hyphenated stuff is Asian Canadian, African Canadian, Latino Canadian. And I think that's what this panel is trying to actually talk about, the notions of inclusivity and that kind of racial project that, say, a field like Canadian literature perpetuates. So, for example, we have a class like Canadian literature. How many of you who've taken Canadian literature often begin the course with Indigenous literature? So to say that Canadian literature was back in 71 seen as a colonial literature, well, it still is, and it is a colonial literature. For many, the study of English studies was meant as a colonial project. So I think that beginning, that statement was actually perpetuating the very thing that we are here to kind of engage and unthink and undo. The second point that I want to kind of engage with has to do with, I want to also put forward the point, when we meet to build alliances and communities, often we think that there's no divisions within these communities. So I want to put it out there. This has been, yes, we've been called to notice that Maclean's article, Asian, was actually referring to Chinese Canadians. Is the Chinese Canadian, would many Chinese Canadians accept what many of you are saying here? I'll be curious to hear that kind of conservatism that for example, we're talking about that Maclean's history. What is the history? If we can maybe historicize this community that we are here engaged in, I think that might actually be also a useful conversation. Thanks.
Sure. No, I think those are both really great points, and actually, I want to actually even further them because I want to perhaps challenge, or not challenge, but like maybe go further on Don's basic point about affirmative action, which is if you actually think about it, there actually has been a sort of affirmative action in Canada, but we haven't actually thought about it as affirmative action, which is that in the 60s and 70s, this whole program to create Canadian literary studies, but also Canadian studies, and also to Canadianize the universities. That, like prior to that point, many of the universities were populated by people who had studied in England or in the United States or elsewhere, and to actually have Canadian graduate programs, that was an affirmative action program. It was affirmative action for Canadians, and so we don't see it as affirmative action, but that is actually the most successful affirmative action program in the Canadian academic history. So I think that's worth thinking about. And actually, the second point, I completely agree with that. There's, I mean, it's always a danger because when we talk about any group, that there's always divisions within groups, and I think that there's. And as Don had mentioned, there's not good sociological discussions that break these things down. But I would imagine that a sociological study of Chinese Canadians would find, vast differences between people whose families had been here for many generations, as against like new immigrants, and anyone who spent time with these communities knows that there are always like a lot of internal divisions, and there's also divisions among those groups in terms of who has access to universities and who doesn't. We shouldn't automatically assume that Chinese immigrants who are coming, the poor Chinese immigrants that are now just coming would immediately have access to the same resources that older communities have. So both points are well taken.
Yes, thank you for reminding us of the important issue, I think, of class and political ideology within any group that creates differences, and I don't think we should presume, although we often act as if everybody within whatever group you're talking about, if it's an African Canadian group that's mobilizing for something, or in this case an Asian Canadian group, you should not think that all of Asian Canada shares the kind of leftist or progressive ideology that people within the activist community share. There is undoubtedly, particularly as Canada has been targeting a particular kind of immigrant within the last 20 years from Asia, there is a significant conservative and right-wing leaning part of the Chinese Canadian and larger Asian Canadian communities as well, who may be actually proud of the model minority myth. And that is something that needs discussion too, and I think should get discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting what you're saying about, you know, people's political stripes. And as an organization that does a lot of work around civic engagement, I get calls all the time, especially around election time, about, you know, how the Chinese community is going to vote and this sort of thing. And, you know, they've always voted liberal before. Are they going to keep voting liberal? And are they all going to vote for Olivia Chow because she's Chinese and all this sort of thing? And I think, you know, especially now as our population has grown bigger and, you know, parties have changed how they do their politics. But I think, you know, in any population, you're going to have right-wing people, you're going to have left-wing people, and you shouldn't expect that ethnic communities are going to vote all in a block. I think it's kind of politically foolish to continue to think that way. And actually, you know, there are more Chinese conservative MPs than there are Chinese MPs of other political stripes. I think it's interesting also your comment around Canadian literature and the idea of hyphenated Canadians, and, you know, the idea of being a racialized Canadian. You know, I would love for Asian Canadian or Chinese Canadian history to be taught as part of Canadian history and not taught as something separate, that this is, like, that we are seen as Canadians and that our history is part of this country's history, right? And my own experience growing up as a Canadian in Toronto, and you know, at recess in the playground, always having these conversations about, you know, where are you from? No, where are you really from? And fighting that for many, many years, until in late high school I just gave up and started identifying myself as a hyphenated Canadian, that I would just tell people that I was Chinese Canadian and not go through that battle. But it was a process for me, and I very much identified as Canadian and wanted to identify as Canadian. You know, ended up working in the environmental sector for 10 years. And it was, again, those sort of experiences of, you know, oh, Karen, can you bring a bunch of Chinese people out to the next tree planting event? Or, you know, can you translate this brochure? And, you know, I grew up in Canada. I don't have Chinese language skills to the fluency that I would like to have. And I didn't have a lot of friends in the Chinese community because I grew up in Toronto and all my friends were second generation Canadians of all different colors, including white. Some of my friends were, you know, European Canadians, second generation European Canadians. So, you know, it was just frustrating to have people sort of make assumptions about who you were and what you knew and who you know. It was with that frustration that I actually left the environmental sector, not because I don't care about the environment, and I still do, and it's still very close to my heart working on those issues, but this issue of them not understanding how to reach out to new Canadian communities is how they used to call us. And I, as a Chinese Canadian, had the opportunity to learn about how my community works. I decided that I was going to stop working with trees and start working with people and figure this out. And I eventually ended up at the Chinese Canadian National Council and have learned a lot in the last 4.5 years about how our communities mobilize, and am now starting to get my organization, a Chinese organization, involved in environmental activities, and have just actually finished writing a grant yesterday to try to get some new conversations happening in the environmental sector, so that they are not treating us like we know nothing about this issue, but they respect the expertise that immigrants bring to this country, that we may understand environmental issues differently and we may use a different language to talk about that issue, but it's not like we don't know what recycling is or we don't know what water conservation is. We just talk about it differently. And if you want to have a real dialogue, and if you want to come up with new problems or new solutions to old problems, that you need to be open to speaking to people in this different kind of way. And anyways, I'm rambling and going off on all kinds of directions. But yeah, thank you for the question. I thought it was very interesting.
Florence, did you?
I just forgot what I was going to say. But in response to the first part of your question, when you look at the response of the Chinese community to this article in particular, it has been varied. And I had a reporter once ask me, "Are you speaking on behalf of all Chinese Canadian youth?" I was like, hell no. Like, I'm speaking on behalf of myself and maybe a few of my friends. And even within my own group of friends, some people won't tell it to my face, but they don't agree with what I have to say. And also in regards to studying, I guess, Canadian literature, Canadian history, I realized that the only time that I had the chance to study, I guess, hyphenated identities, histories of hyphenated Canadians was in my race and ethnic studies class, where it was just about the racism that each group experienced. So that was, hyphenated Canadian history for me, and basically how horrible it was for them.
Sure.
I would add to that, I would hope that the effect of an article like Two Asian from Maclean's would have on, say, the Chinese Canadian community is to make those who might think that, yes, they were in with the Ken Whites of the world and shared the same kind of rightist ideology, that doesn't protect them from the racism that comes out of white Canada, that when it comes to racism, they get lumped by the dominant culture as a group, no matter what views they hold, and that it might mobilize the whole large segments of the community into recognizing how racism operates.
So this is one of these moments where if there's one more question, that's great, but it'll be the last one. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Does somebody else have
No.
I don't know if the last word was... Okay. Sorry. Mine's actually, two hopefully smallish comments, but I'm a bit rambly also. But okay, so I'm absolutely on board with holding this author accountable, holding Ken White accountable, holding Maclean's accountable. But what scares me most about this article is how it's been taken up, how it speaks to so, and I know that everyone was sort of implicitly saying this, but the way that it speaks to the dominant Canadian imaginary is absolutely terrifying, and particularly the white Canadian imaginary. And so I'm absolutely in favor of rallying around this issue, around responses to the Maclean's article, but I think that there really needs to be a much broader conversation also, because it's absolutely a catalyst, but there's all this stuff that it's lighting on fire. So that's one. And then the other one was, I just wanted to mention the way that, privilege perpetuates itself in a variety of ways, and it's very skilled at doing that. One of the most, well, no, maybe not the most, but anyway, one of these ways is by engaging in a discourse of victimization, and so I just, sort of wanted to open that up a little bit, that,
our rightful place is being threatened, and we see this over and over, very powerful countries saying that they are victims, feminism is a threat to, et cetera, lots of capacities. And so I guess I just wanted to talk, I don't know, maybe state explicitly what lots of people are thinking, that how privilege, sort of relies on continuing to do this. So thank you all so much. It was wonderful.
Thanks. Thank you. So, oh, sorry. Go ahead. So there is, I didn't realize you'd been waiting. Go ahead.
Well, I hope my question will be short because I know everyone is waiting. But I was trying to address that I think what we are trying to achieve through such a meeting is that we are trying to achieve universality of human value as opposed to racial differences. So I was thinking, I feel as we are making too much emphasis on racial differences, racial national differences. So do you think we can achieve that universality or globalism while we are emphasizing on our racial differences? Do you think we can achieve that?
Here's a simple yes or no from each one of the panelists.
I'll just, we're near the end, so I'll make this very brief, which is that I think that the universal only exists through the form of the particular, and I think that the example that maybe everyone can respond to is literature, that you would have a writer like Faulkner who's writing about the particularity of the American South, but it becomes universal because he describes this reality well, or in our case, someone like Alice Munro writing about the particular experiences of a particular white Canadian experience, but it has universal reference. So the universality is possible, but it only comes through the inspection of the particular. But again, there's a fellow by the name of G.F. Hagel who wrote a great deal about this, and I think that's where we would have to go.
Thank you.
Karen, were you reaching to respond? You're going to let that. Florence, John. One of the something we're very grateful at this moment is that Brad Lee created this Facebook site so that this conversation can continue to happen there, and of course can continue to happen amongst us as real people in this room as well. I wanted to mention we've been taking notes, the three or four of us here, about themes that we wanted to pursue from this event, and again we'll share those on Brad's site. Let me just run through very briefly some of the ways forward that were identified here. There was discussion about how significant the new social media is, how swift a response it can generate, its space for ongoing discussion, wide participation, but also I think a real sense that its greatest strength is when it's paired well with face-to-face interaction and the coming out to demonstration and rally and some of the first moments of public speaking of people who will clearly be important activists. The other very specific suggestion was around affirmative action in the university context to redress discrimination. And I guess I was struck by the importance of both the practice of affirmative action, the policy of affirmative action, and the worldview that underpins it, that creates all sorts of possibilities, affirmative action being one. And then that all of our work be bolstered by this very strong awareness of historical continuities, the kind of repetition of these sorts of events, and also the ways that we can repeat and learn from the responses that our predecessors have made and one another have made. So with that, very deep thank you to all of the panelists. This has been very, very wonderful to have you here, and thank you to all of you for participating.